Hi, I'm Kim Atherton, and I'm here to talk about how HR is getting it wrong. In terms of an intro, I am the CEO and founder of a software company, Just Three Things. I started my career as a Chartered Occupational Psychologist and then became Chief People Officer for a fast-growth unicorn company called OVO Energy. So how do we know that HR is getting it wrong? A recent Forbes article quoted the depressing statistic that over 70% of us are unhappy at work. This lack of engagement makes people almost 3 times as likely to leave their jobs, and it actually impairs our strategic thinking and ability to be creative. And yet there's a huge opportunity if we can get this right. For example, Gallup, which is one of the largest engagement survey tools on the market, said that the engaged employees lead to at least 17% more profitability and 41% fewer absences. So there's a huge opportunity for us to make a difference to business if we can engage our employees. There's also more chief HR officers sitting on boards than ever before. So what's going wrong and why are HR interventions not working? Some of the answer to that question comes from the roots of HR. HR only emerged as a specific field in the early 20th century, influenced by Taylorism, which really saw each employee as a kind of cog in a wheel. And Taylorism was all about improving economic efficiency in manufacturing jobs. In the early 60s, US legislation started to promote fair employment practices, which was awesome. So things like Equal Pay Act and Civil Rights Acts, all fantastic. But HR then morphed into trying to protect the company, and they really weren't on the side of the employee. In the 80s, organisational management and industrial psychology contributed to HR paying more attention to employees' need for achievement and advancement and motivation and so forth. And now modern HR says it's all about engagement and culture and people development. But is it really? The CIPD, which is the largest chartered body of HR professionals in Europe, said that human resource management has 4 basic functions: staffing, performance and appraisal, training and development, and then motivation. So I'm going to look a little bit more closely at the employee in-life parts of that. First, the dreaded performance review. According to strategic HR management, 91% of organisations conduct some form of performance review or appraisal, but only 8% of employees find that motivating. The typical performance conversation is annual or biannual and involves the dreaded rating conversation. We've all been there, when the employee sits patiently as their manager goes through the charade of dusting off the objectives set and forgotten about a year ago, and then talking about feedback, and all the while we're sitting there thinking, come on, just give me the rating. We all know that's why we're there. Those ratings are then taken into calibration, where each manager sits there and defends their people as to why they should remain at the rating that they've given them. This process is awful. It's so time-consuming for managers. It's really demotivating for most employees, apart from those who are rated in the top category. But furthermore, it really focuses on individuals, and so it really undermines the team-based ethos that a lot of us are trying to install in organisations. When people are in competition with each other rather than working together for the best business outcome, it really means that we are all competing rather than collaborating. Furthermore, it undermines the idea of psychological safety that is needed for teams to test and learn, to experiment, to innovate. And as we all know, in these uncertain times, and Corona really impacting this, the need for innovation and being adaptable and nimble is really key to business success. Finally, performance appraisals are really based on individual objectives typically set a year ago. And as we all know, in these uncertain times, objectives just change constantly. I don't think there's probably a single person listening to this whose personal objectives are the same now as they were before the Corona outbreak. The main reason that companies still do performance reviews is meant to be to motivate people, which, as we know, it just doesn't, but also to manage underperformance. And that's typically because the organisation hasn't invested in enough training or development in their leaders to equip them to have those difficult conversations without the tool of a performance review. So it really is using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So once our performance is rated, most organisations then go on to rate potential in order to map employees onto a typical 9-box grid. Again, in my opinion, this is a totally flawed process. Most managers think of potential as, can this person do my job, rather than thinking about learning agilities or growth mindset needed for an individual to flex their approach and take on a different role. Those who are rated as high potential usually get more training budget approved. However, again, training in most organisations is fundamentally flawed. Typically, individuals get to choose from a catalogue that's been approved centrally by HR, who really don't have any clue about the type of development or training that people in different technical disciplines might want, for example. The effectiveness of the training is assessed by happy sheets, where participants rate whether they feel their performance will improve as a result of the training. And these happy sheets are typically given out at the end of the training when people feel great and think, yeah, absolutely, this is going to really improve my performance. But that's never assessed again. So in most organisations, that's never really, the effectiveness of training isn't really measured against anything like quality of output or contribution to business outcomes. So even if we all hate performance appraisals, and even if we don't feel that training and development works, surely we like free food. And so employee perks are another big train for HR. But Gartner reports that perks just mean nothing if the individual isn't happy with the fundamental parts of their role. So if these things don't work, what does? I want to talk to you a little bit about what we did at OVO. And this is not to say that we got everything right. In fact, I give a much longer talk about how all the things we got wrong and all the mistakes I made. But just to try to draw out some of our learnings. To give some context for this, when I first joined OVO, there were around about 50 people in the company. And when I left in 2018, there were around 2,000 employees, and we were about to acquire the retail arm of Scottish and Southern, which was about 8,000 of that 20,000 people that you can see on this screen. So we went from essentially 50 people to around about 9,000 in 10 years. So given that context and the fact we were pivoting and going through agile transformations, we were also managing HR in the background. And I spent a lot of time making all the mistakes that we talked about. So I did performance reviews, training, all the things that we talked about. But what I really found was that actually what truly motivates and engages employees isn't anything to do with centralized, siloed HR initiatives. It's much more around feeling that they have a really valuable contribution to make to the organization, that they really understand how they fit in with the bigger picture, that they can really feel empowered to really focus on what matters, to make a difference, and to experiment and innovate. So really, I think I would summarize the learnings as, if you wanted to really engage employees, I would recommend 3 things. So the first one is around clearly defining direction. So a lot has been written on the power of really distributing decision-making and empowering teams to be able to contribute to the business strategy. But to do that, and in order to get that motivational uplift, you really need to clearly define the direction and communicate that effectively. And most HR professionals wouldn't see that as their role, but actually communicating that direction has such a huge impact on motivation. So the thing that really brought us together at OVO during the really fast growth, during all of these ups and downs, was a real focus on the purpose and the mission of the company. So with the people joined for the purpose, which was around decarbonising the energy industry. And what I found was communicating that all the time and really making everyone aware of what they were doing toward that was really, really, really key to motivating people. The second thing we did was try to focus on outcomes, not output. So I think we certainly fell into the mistake to start with of managing by output, so features or projects or initiatives. And actually that really hampers people's creativity, their motivation, their engagement, because essentially all they're doing is delivering a thing and then tick box, done that. So instead, we really moved to leading and managing through outcomes. And we used OKRs, but there's lots of different ways to do this. But essentially, these were setting out the business outcomes that we would like the teams to achieve, and then really empowering them to generate the experiments, the hypotheses, and the things they felt they could deliver in order to meet this business outcomes, and then obviously to learn from those. The second thing we did was we tried to really focus on what matters. So one of the big learnings for me was that people become very demotivated when they just have too much to do. It's almost that learned helplessness. It's impossible for me to do all of this, or impossible for my team to do all of this. So why do I even bother? So the first thing we did was start to prioritise the goals. What's the most important things that the business needs to achieve this quarter or this year? And then allowing everybody else to align their priorities to that. We were going through an agile transformation, so we were moving from a typical kind of monolith to flotilla of ships, more product-led, smaller teams. And we found that actually breaking down those silos and having teams very, very, very clear on the outcomes that they needed to achieve had more of a motivational boost than any training budget I could have ever provided. Finally, we encouraged our teams and really tried to empower them to track their progress against the outcomes, learn from what was working and what wasn't, and adapt their approach. And we really tried to push down as much data as we could to the team so that we could distribute that decision making and really help them to work out what the best route forward was. And obviously, as CEO and founder of Just Three Things, it will be remiss of me not to mention that I also built a piece of software that would help embed this way of working. So essentially that we were able to set out our direction. We were able to allow our teams to, in a completely transparent manner, focus on what matters, and everybody could see the work of every other team. And really importantly, to track their progress, to record their learnings, and to adapt their approach. And again, to record all of that so we didn't have these horrible silos or people pulling against each other. So not to say that this was an incredibly smooth journey, and as I say, we made lots of mistakes. We only took away individual performance reviews a couple of years before I left, so it's not that we did everything perfectly. But we did have some great outcomes. So we moved from 172nd to 20th in the Sunday Times Best Place to Work, increased productivity, and really importantly to me, people really felt that their work made a valuable contribution. Just Three Things as a business was so successful at OVO that we spun out as a separate company in 2018, and we now work with a whole range of organisations, helping them to embed that way of working that we discovered at OVO. So in conclusion, I think what isn't working in HR, I think HR needs to fundamentally shift its approach from being a siloed function, which is really focused on its own agenda, to moving to much more of a facilitator. So for me, this is very much like the transition that managers need to make if we're going to really empower teams, is to move from almost a manager that tells people what to do and manages by kind of direction, to a leader who coaches and provides the environment for the person to do their best. And I think that's what HR needs to do, is to fundamentally shift that mindset from being a function that almost kind of has the rule book and tells people what to do, or says, you must go on our training, you must go through our performance reviews and so forth, to much more of a coach that helps to provide the environment for the organisation to succeed. Thank you very much.